history of King Arthur is becoming more and more interesting to me, because as I dig deeper into this thing, what I'm finding is that I'm seeing that there are all of these connections relevant to Saturn theory. Not only am I finding connections 100% relevant to Saturn theory, but I'm also finding connections that are also relevant to other catastrophes that would take place later after the Saturnian breakup. Now, I already covered a lot of the basics of what we are dealing with in an episode before this, so go and check that out first to get a foundational level explanation of what we're talking about. So in this show, what I want to do is I want to continue going on. And I was going to continue more with the general story of King Arthur and go over multiple aspects. However, I think we might just focus on maybe only one or two aspects of the Arthurian mythology in this show, mainly because what I'm finding is that there's a particular part of this story. I mean, really all the parts of the story. This is all relatively new to me. I'm not an Arthurian mythologist here. I'm not some expert on Arthur. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that. So the position that I'm coming from is very much just an objective. I don't have any preconceived notions when it comes to this story. Now, the strength in that means that I'm not coming at you with any expectations. I'm not claiming that this story is doing one specific thing over another thing. So that's an advantage scientifically. So that's what we get out of this. Okay, anyway. All right, so let's move on with the next part of the story. And what I want to do is I want to compare this next part of the story to other mythologies all over the planet, and really outline how extremely similar everybody's stories are, and also use this as proof of the eyewitness testimony of what our ancestors saw in the past, relevant to the Saturnian breakup and the events that transpired after that. Alright, so on the last show, we left off where Camelot was essentially created. Now, as a quick recap for Camelot may very well represent the golden age that existed before the Saturnian breakup. And in fact, I'm willing to bet that that is exactly what the original concept of Camelot was supposed to be. Now, I know there are other ideas and concepts of what Camelot could be as well, and I've talked about that. And that's really this is going to go for any aspect of the Arthurian story that we cover. I'm well aware that there are other interpretations of a lot of the stuff we are going to discuss. But one of the things that we're going to focus on these shows is we're going to try to find the original meaning of what these stories were trying to convey. So what I mean by that is we are going to try to go back as far as we can to find the original versions of the stories. Now, how do I know that we have the original version of the story? Well, technically I don't. I don't know which is technically going to be the oldest in theory. However, what we can do is we can compare the Arthurian legends to other stories around the planet which are ancient as well, and see which ones line up with each other. And what that'll do is that'll give us a better grasp on which aspects of the Arthurian story are more original versus what were altered down the line. Now, another thing you have to remember with the Arthurian legend, and this happens in mythologies everywhere, is that as time progresses, the legend is going to be altered by the very people who are responsible for recording it. So what I mean by that is this. The Saturnian breakup takes place thousands of years ago, right? And I don't have a date for you guys, by the way. It could have been 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, right? Maybe a little longer. I don't know. But it's the oldest catastrophe that we kind of have on record that we know of, as far as I'm aware, right? The Saturnian breakup really does kick off everything that leads up to today. Because before the Saturnian breakup, we all apparently lived in a golden age where everybody was happy doing drugs and had no problems at all. It was all good in the hood. Right? That ends once the Saturnian breakup happens. So where we find ourselves today is a direct consequence of that event. Now, there's other events that will take place afterwards because of the absolute chaos that, takes place during the Saturnian breakup. And that is what's actually going to cause one of our problems. So, when the Saturnian breakup goes down, cultures all over the planet, wherever they were, whoever they were, that's a whole other problem in and of itself. They go out of their way to record the event. And they, of course, will then try to transmit that down the lineages. What happens, though, is that the Saturnian configuration is not the only catastrophe that takes place. The very nature of the Saturnian breakup is catastrophic on an entire solar system-wide scale, right? Or a 2 solar system-wide scale, if you really want to get into it. Right? You have absolute chaos. Earth is just this small planet being bounced around. Right? So it's not just that you have to survive the Saturnian breakup, you have to survive the fallout. So while the people back in the day recorded the Saturnian configuration breakup, what happens is that more events take place afterwards. And so their descendants start to record other catastrophic events that actually did take place. But as time marches on, the descendants will inevitably lose the real connection to the real events that the story was originally trying to convey. So what I mean by that is that everybody eventually will fall into a disassociative state relative to the original content. This is a natural human psychological event. There's really no way around this. To put this into context, imagine your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma. Okay, she's dead. She's gone. How sad have you ever been for that event? Right? She's directly related to you, that she matters in your life, obviously. But you've probably never shed a single tear for that woman, and in reality is you probably have no idea who she even is. Right? You have a disassociative, you are in a disassociative state relative to that event. And it's not that you went out of your way to do it. You're not a douchebag. It's just a natural human disconnect. That's what happens. So, while the Saturnian breakup is a monumental catastrophic event, right, that was mind-blowing for the time. If we were to experience even a fraction of that today, it would be hilarious. There would be mass psychosis on this planet. It would be insane. But hey, you know what? Over time, those events just start to matter less and less, and then eventually you get to a point to where you just have no connection to that event whatsoever. Like you have no physical connection to it anymore. It's just a story. And of course, the final thing that will afflict you, that will create your disassociative state, or that will solidify it, I guess is what I should say, is that you have nothing in the real world to compare the old events to. And that's actually one of the huge issues that we see today, and that's one of the things that uniformitarianism, this concept of uniformitarianism, is doing to corrupt the masses. Basically what's going on in the modern day is that if we do not see it taking place today, it never happened. That is literally what scientists in the modern age believe. And they believe that for all kinds of reasons, which is outside of the scope of this talk. I know, I'm babbling. My main point is that if you do not have a reference to an event in real life anymore, you get into a disassociative state. We have it nowadays because, for example, we don't have other planetoids, flying through the sky in front of us, right? Venus is not threatening Earth. Mars is not threatening Earth. Saturn is not a red dwarf. These planetary bodies are little dots in the sky, and they don't matter. So it's really hard for us to believe or think that perhaps, Saturn could have been a red dwarf. Even though there is nothing scientifically inaccurate about this claim, right? The vast majority of people have been conditioned to not even entertain such a possibility simply because it does not exist right now. Okay. So as the stories are created, once again, this is everywhere all over the planet, what happens is that the ancestors of these people, they just lose the connection. But they are going to be dealing with their own problems that they are going to add to the histories. So not only will you eventually run into a situation to where the Saturnian event is described and it sounds insane, but then you're going to have other insane catastrophic events that other people are going to record and throw it on top of that mythology. And then once all of these catastrophic events are done, gone, and played out, and the solar system is calm again, suddenly we're faced with the issue of having these, insane mythologies packed with all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and we have absolutely nothing to compare them against in real life today. It's just not there. So we all get into a disassociative state. We've all suffered from it. All of our ancestors have suffered from it. And what happens is, though, is that as other catastrophes are taking place later after the Saturnian event, those ancestors of the people who are recording what they're doing might manipulate the story a little bit to better fit in with their personal history. So they have no connection to the Saturnian event anymore, but they have a connection to their current catastrophic event. And so what they do is, the stories kind of twist and get melded into new things over time. This is why, for example, when we look at the Arthurian legends, we have a lot of different versions. And so this is our problem. So that's why what I'm trying to do, or what we will do in this, it's just me, but you know what I'm saying. You guys can maybe help me out, find stuff and post it so I can read it. What we can do, though, is we need to find the oldest versions. The best way to do that will be to compare the Arthurian legends with other older versions of other cultures' stories, and then maybe we can tease out the original. Now, the reality is, will we ever be able to get the 100% original version of the Arthurian tale? Or of any other mythology? No, probably not. That stuff is realistically gone. Second law of thermodynamics is alive and well, and it's, it's gone. We can only do what we can do, but let's see what we can do here. Alright, so we left off on Camelot, Golden Age, blah, 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 went through other stuff. Okay, so the next situation that we need to discuss, relevant to the Arthurian legend, is going to be his queen, Guinevere. Now, if you are classically trained right now, you're probably imagining King Arthur as a human, right? Wearing armor, crown, whatever, beard. Next to him is this incredibly hot woman, Guinevere, hot, wearing a dress, sexy, whatever. Humans, maybe sitting in some thrones or standing in a grass valley of I don't know. Anyway, two humans, right? You get it. However, for our analogy, we are not going to be looking at really any of these characters in the story at all as humans. What we are going to do is we are going to look at King Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot as planetary bodies instead. Now, if you're new to this, I know that might sound insane, and this is probably not going to change that, so you might want to go watch some other shows first. But for those of you who know what I'm talking about, relevant or relative to mythologies and characters not being, gods in the sky or anything, or human characters or whatever, but instead all of these mythologies are referencing planets, we might be able to paint a completely different picture of what the original story that the Arthurian legend was trying to portray. So let's talk about our three main characters. Guinevere, who is the queen, eventually, of King Arthur. And then at some point there will be a betrayal described where a new character, Lancelot, will show up and he will steal Queen Guinevere away from Arthur. Now, okay, let's do this. Let me give you guys a quick general breakdown of this story, and then we will start to analyze all of it. So let's go over the basics really fast. Okay. So basically, when Arthur had taken the throne and peace had begun to bloom across Britain, he sought not just a queen, but a companion worthy of the throne beside him. Essentially, someone whose spirit would match his own. And he eventually found Guinevere, who was a daughter of King Leogradance of Cameliard. And yeah, I probably pronounced that wrong, but I'm stupid, so just, leave me alone, okay? Now, another interesting thing to note before we go further here, and something to think about in mythology, is when we find characters who are children of other characters. Generally, what this could mean in mythology, if we are talking of these characters as planetary bodies, what it means is that our ancestors may have witnessed one planet literally spit out another. So, for example, if you had a red dwarf star out there, still visible, that red dwarf star could have still spat out other planets, in which case you would describe this as, one character giving birth to another. You also could have a situation to where one planet was simply eclipsed by another planet for a long time, and then suddenly showed up, out from behind the other planet, as all the orbits were changing, and that also could have looked like, a birth. So it would have been like one planet giving birth to another planet, which means you would have a parent-child situation. So just something to think about. So, Guinevere is a known child of another king. Now, I don't have an answer for who King Leogradance is, planet-wise. It's either and this is where the mythologies can get weird. So here, I'll just spoil it. Well, no, okay, let's go on. Okay, anyway, so Guinevere is the daughter of a king. Okay. She's a woman of grace and beauty. She's intelligent, regal, eyes like the morning sky. Arthur loved her instantly, not for power, but for the deep longing of his heart. Leogradance, grateful for Arthur's friendship, gave his daughter willingly, and with her the round table itself as a dowry. Now, the round table is also potentially plasma iconography that our ancestors are using to describe something they saw in the sky. One of the other things that we have to pay attention into the mythologies, and we're not going to do that, we're not going to talk about the table here, but anytime you see inanimate objects being described, taking or playing a larger role with the gods, there's a good chance that they are describing something that they were witnessing up in the sky going on alongside the planetary movements. And of course, a lot of the stuff they would have been seeing was plasma formations. Because as all these planets are moving around and trying to get back into their current orbits we see them in today, you would have had all kinds of electromagnetic disturbances taking place due to the, electrical environment that we found ourselves in back then, and all kinds of visual effects would have been seen by our ancestors. Right? That solar wheel iconography, this round table, etc. The round table probably represents some kind of a plasma formation. Okay, anyway, let's go on. Okay, so, but it's also interesting to note who gets credit for bringing that table in. What that does is that gives us a connection of a plasma formation to a possible planetary body. So us trying to figure out who that original king was, that would be helpful. And for fun, so Saturn really does get the credit for being the creator in everybody's mythologies. However, Saturn is also the son of somebody else, and eventually is, the offspring of himself. But that we'll get into that. Well, so who created Saturn then? So for whatever reason, Uranus seems to get the credit for that. Now I don't know why. And that's going way far back in history, and we probably don't have any good evidence to explain what the hell was going on back then, because this would have been like either during the Golden Age or pre-Golden Age times. And any information regarding that is probably just non-existent. Anyway, okay, you guys get it. Okay, so that's our setup. So Arthur marries Guinevere. So in the sky, okay, let's keep going. Now, here's what happens. We have a new character come into play, and this would be Sir Lancelot. Now, to protect and serve his queen, Arthur summons the finest knight of all, Sir Lancelot de Luc, or de Lac, a man of unmatched honor and strength, raised by the mystical Lady of the Lake. Lancelot pledges his life to Arthur and Guinevere's safety. Yet, in time, Lancelot and Guinevere grew close. Too close. What began as a devotion turned into longing. They resisted at first, bound by duty and guilt, but their hearts defied them. And so you get a situation to where, quote, in secret gardens and hushed chambers, love blossomed in silence. They were soul-bound, but bound by treason. Guinevere loved Arthur, but Lancelot ignited the fire she buried under her crown. So we have a love triangle. Now this love triangle is going to be important because we find in mythologies during the Saturnian time period this exact situation everywhere. Okay, anyway. So what goes on is eventually Mordred, Arthur's bitter son, or nephew, depending on, which version you're talking about, he uncovers the truth. And then what he does is he's a douchebag, so he goes and he exposes the affair to the king and to the court. So Arthur finds himself torn between his duty as king and his grief as a husband. So he had Guinevere arrested, sentencing her to death by fire. That iconography might be extremely important. Fire. Death by fire. Okay, but not out of hatred, but because the law demanded it. But Lancelot came in fury, riding through the fire and blood of Camelot, slaying his former brethren to save his beloved. He carried Guinevere away to sanctuary in a monastery. But his sword had split the Round Table itself. The Brotherhood of Camelot was then shattered. Now, I haven't talked about the knights yet. We haven't covered those guys, and we'll cover them eventually. But I wanted to... I gotta pick a subject, so we're going to talk about Arthur and Guinevere, okay? And Lancelot plays a part. Anyway. So there's a couple pieces here that are also going to be interesting to the iconography. We find a sword playing a pivotal role, and his sword splits the Round Table itself. So remember that. We have the Round Table, a sword, and the Round Table splitting. Alright, so, in the aftermath, Arthur was left broken. The once unified court, the shining symbol of justice and unity, was now fractured by love, pride, and war. Now we have a situation to where some tales say that Arthur forgave Guinevere, visiting her in her nunnery before his final battle. She had taken vows, her beauty was, now veiled in sorrow, all that garbage. And she asked nothing of him but peace, like, leave me alone. Others say they never met again. All right, so there's no continuation of these guys talking or doing anything. Which one is the true one? I don't know. This is probably a situation to where the story is added on to later for whatever reason. And I already talked about the possible reasons why. So what we have here is the main thing to take away from all this garbage is that we have a love triangle. We have some extremely poignant iconography. And we have some very express or explicit events that happen. Now, this is what I find interesting. All right, so let's set this. Well, here, let's set the stage of the characters before we go further. Who the hell is King Arthur planet-wise? Let's do this. So, in my opinion, as far as I can tell, it seems like Saturn would be King Arthur. Who's Guinevere? In my opinion, I believe Venus is Guinevere. Who is Lancelot? I would believe that Jupiter is Lancelot. Alright, so we have those three main planetary bodies that, in theory, our ancestors would be able to see in the sky. Now, don't forget, Jupiter would not look like Jupiter as Jupiter looks now. Saturn would also look generally different. And both planets would have been much closer to planet Earth. And they probably both would have still been larger in size in general. Because remember, well, for sure, Saturn would have been a red dwarf, maybe a brown dwarf, right? Maybe a brown dwarf, probably a brown dwarf. One of the two. Brown dwarf. So what that means is that they would not have been little dots in the sky. They would have been closer. Because remember, the Saturnian configuration had broken up at this point in time, but all the planetary bodies were still, in chaotic orbits. All planetary bodies were adjusting to the current electromagnetic environment that they found themselves in. And as they're doing that, this is what is going to drive the drama of all of these mythologies. So when we start looking at this love triangle, and you're wondering how the planets are moving around, well, the planets are all being driven by electromagnetism, right? Everybody is trying to acclimate to their new electrical environment, and while they're doing this, everybody's zooming around each other. And this is where all the chaos will come from. But, during times or periods to where humans could, just sit back and watch what was going on up in the sky, and they weren't necessarily running for their lives, they were watching this drama, this planetary drama unfold. And to record the planetary drama, they gave the planets names. And then they tried to describe the planetary movements in a sense that humans would understand. Now, it would have been better had they just explain the planetary movements in pure scientific notation, but the reality is, at this point in time, that may not have been possible. Remember, the Saturnian breakup is what causes the deluge. So the deluge is absolutely world-destroying. It destroys all civilizations on Earth. It kills basically everybody. The survivors are few, let's put it like that. Anybody who does survive that, they no longer have access to whatever technology may have existed. And I don't even have any reason to believe that, in the antediluvian world, people were rocking high levels of technology. That's something that, a lot of alternative people I don't think they appreciate enough. We have no real reason to believe that prior to the deluge, humans had all this insane technology. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. You could really make the argument that humans were essentially, sort of extremely lower class life forms within the pecking order biologically. And I'm not going to get into that. Anyway, so deluge happens, wipes everybody out. The survivors are, they start to reproduce, they start to do what they can, but they're starting from scratch. So they have to recount what they're watching in the sky, and they don't have telescopes, right? They don't have all this trigonometry. They're not doing real astronomy, right? They're not doing any of that because they lost it all. What are they writing on? They're not using computers. They're not using tablets. They're not even really carving anything into stone all that much. The best thing that they have is simple oral tradition. And of course, to convey oral tradition, the best way to do that is to create a story that resonates with people. And then over time, of course, we get into a disassociative state to where we lose the fact that these stories were describing planetary motions and not, human drama, and then we get to where we are now. Okay, anyway. You know what the advantage of having no subscribers is that I can say whatever I want and nobody cares because nobody listens. I can repeat myself like 1,000 times and it's irrelevant. Okay, so those are our three main characters relative to planetary forms. Okay, so what's going on? All right, well, we have a situation to where Arthur is a king, and he has ushered in a golden age, so that is exactly what Saturn does, right? And if you follow more of Arthur's story, which we will in a later episode, it's kind of weird, I know. I didn't do this very intelligently, so I'm just trying to focus on Guinevere, Arthur, and Lancelot. Anyway, so the story of Arthur basically really does follow a very standard Golden Age story. So at some point in time, our ancestors are looking up at the sky and a new drama starts to unfold. three planetary bodies start to come into close contact with one another. And these three planetary bodies are Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. So what happens when you have three electrically charged planetary bodies who come close to one another and whose electromagnetic fields touch? Well, you're going to have all kinds of things start happening. Once these three planetary bodies start influencing one another, you're going to have a drama play out. And that's exactly what the story describes. And there's going to be some caveats here, which we'll cover after I go over this. So what it sounds like basically happens is this. At some point in time, Venus is chilling with Saturn to some degree, and everything's fine and happy. Right? All the humans on Earth are generally fine, happy. They're not worried about chaos and stuff like that. They see Venus up there close to Saturn. I don't know what the exact configuration would be. I don't know if... Well, Venus would not be orbiting Saturn, let's put it like that. But I can't tell you exactly what's going on up there. All we can say for sure is that Venus would have been visually close relative to Saturn from Earth. That's the way it would have looked. And Saturn and Venus would have probably shared similar orbits. That makes sense, by the way, because as far as we can tell, Saturn gives birth to Venus during the Saturnian breakup. So their orbits would, be relatively close to one another in theory. All right, so we actually kind of would expect Venus and Saturn to hang out close to one another as the solar system is reconfiguring itself. Now, the problem comes into play when Jupiter shows up on the scene. So what happens here? Well, now we have a third large planetary body with, also, a large electromagnetic field, and it's coming into the scene. What it sounds like happens is this. When Jupiter starts to get closer to these two planetary bodies, it sounds like Jupiter's electromagnetic force was simply more powerful than Saturn's, and of course, way more powerful than Venus's. And that starts to change that configuration up there. What seems to happen is this. Jupiter will attract Venus, and it will repel Saturn. This is all scientifically viable. There's nothing weird about this. If you have a larger body coming into two other smaller, lesser charged bodies, the larger body is absolutely going to have an influence, and the end result is exactly what this love triangle describes. Jupiter steals Venus away from Saturn and pushes Saturn further away. This is what our ancestors saw in the night sky, and this is how they described it. This would have been a direct aftermath of the Saturnian breakup. They only describe it as a love triangle, like I said, because that's the only means they really have to explain it. But this is the event that they see. Now, with respect to the Arthurian legend, there's a couple problems that I have. And these problems probably stem from the other issues I explained earlier on when you have, more of other stories being tacked on to the main story. Well, here, let's talk about that really quick. So, if you guys remember, I had pointed out a couple of very important pieces of iconography. We had the Round Table existing during this period of time, plays a direct role between Guinevere and Arthur. We also have a situation to where Lancelot's sword shows up, right? And Lancelot ends up shattering the Round Table, breaking it in half. Now, the Round Table is probably the solar wheel symbolism that we find all over the planet. That's recorded everywhere. The breakup of that solar wheel appears to be another plasma formation that looked like a sword. Now, this appears to have come out of the planetary body that, steals Venus. Now, the reason why I'm not mentioning the specific planetary body, in this case Jupiter, is because later on down the line, we have a situation to where Mars will also be associated with a sword. So is it possible Lancelot is Mars? I don't think so, because I want to say that that event will come later, long after this, but that doesn't mean that there was not another kind of plasma configuration that looked like a sword that is described here in this story earlier on in history. See, this is the problem. This is a perfect example of the problem we face in mythology with respect to other mythologies that will get tacked on and alter the original. Because you'll have events that sound like they're the same thing, so people will lump them in together as the same thing instead of separating them as two separate events. Yeah, okay, so for example, with the sword iconography that I just gave you guys, the reason why I think they are two separate events is simple. So there's a point in time during, apparently, the Zero event, which would have only been about 1,000 years ago, to where Mars does do a close flyby of Earth several times, but at some point in time, it has a plasma formation of what is described as a sword, but it is also described as a wolf, as a dog, as a jackal, etc. during this period of time. So whatever that plasma formation looked like, it looked like something like a sword potentially, or something like a wolf or a dog or something like that. Okay, and we could pretty easily probably come up with a configuration that shares that kind of iconography. So when we go and we look at the Arthur situation, we don't hear anything about wolves or jackals or anything like that. Right? There's nothing going on there. So that's why I think that's enough evidence to at least say that these are two separate events. Because nobody's talking about, a wolf. Okay, and anyway, just throwing that out there. So that's just something to keep an eye on, all right? Anyway, all right, so is this part of the story simply describing a particular planetary event that our ancestors saw thousands of years ago? Like, is that what is going on here? And in all honesty, I think that's exactly what we're seeing. The problem is that we aren't getting, like, the perfect picture, obviously. We're getting a very vague idea of what went on, and then to make matters worse, we have to deal with the fact that, people down the line added to the story and may have mucked up some of it. So, problems everywhere. Now, of course, the core concept that we are discussing right now with respect to the Arthurian language is a cosmological event, or is in relation to a cosmological event. If we have some kind of a grand cosmological event like the Saturnian configuration breakup, we really should find this story replicated to some degree or another all over the planet. Because a cosmological event on this scale, to where we have, Saturn moving from a red dwarf phase into, what it is now today, everybody is going to see that. Don't forget, Saturn is much closer to Earth during this time period. Same with Venus and Jupiter. Everybody more or less is going to have a front row seat to this event. So we really should find this story in other mythologies all over the planet as well, because everybody should see it. And that's exactly what we find. Now, remember, one of the other things that I'm looking for is the older versions of these stories. Not the ones that have been twisted and added onto, to the best ability that we can find. We're never going to find the perfect event. So here, really quick, let's go over some of the comparative mythologies that tie into the Arthurian mythos that might give us some substantiation that the Arthurian mythology is indeed talking about the Saturnian breakup. So, for example, if we go over to ancient Egypt, there's that whole story of Zep Tepi. Now, Zep Tepi gets a little weird because there's other details which might relate to maybe the Venus event, but there is a core ideology that goes on before the Zep Tepi thing goes down, and that would be dealing with Osiris, Isis, and Set. Remember, one of the core things that we are going to be looking for is going to be this trinity. And I guess before I go any further, not everybody, but most people are familiar with another kind of trinity in the West that deals with the Bible, right? The biblical trinity. I don't know if the biblical trinity would have anything to do with this. I'm not saying it doesn't, But at the same time, I don't really believe it does. I'm happy to be wrong. If anybody can actually, I don't know, support it or prove or disprove it, feel free, right? Tell me in the comments. I don't care. But I don't think that the Trinity replicated in the Bible is the same concept here. It doesn't jive. I just wanted to throw that out. Anyway, so in ancient Egypt, you have a trinity of three gods that go through basically the same kinds of concept. Right? You have an Osiris, Isis, and Set situation. Here, you have three core gods that go through similar conflict, just as in the Arthurian mythos. Now, right now, if you're well versed on the Osiris, Isis, and Set situation, you could say that there are differences, and I agree. But don't forget, remember, there's going to be differences for two reasons. The first reason is that these mythologies have had time to have been changed and or added onto. And the second reason is that not everybody is going to describe the drama in the same way. So for example, Saturn in the Arthurian legend is a king. Saturn in the Egyptian legend, he's like the creator of everything. Right? So the nomenclatures are going to be different, but the concepts remain the same. So if we move over to, say, Greek, right, Greek mythology, and of course Greek mythology was probably stolen for the Pelasgians, and of course Greek mythology isn't even written until like 1100 AD anyways, but that's a whole other story. Anyways, what we consider Greek mythology, we have the same situation with Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Ares. Now, this one can get a little weird because it is also possible that this particular trinity is talking about the Venus event itself. And one of the reasons why I'm pointing out trinities that might not actually line up at all with the Arthurian legend is for this main reason. What I want to do is I want to show you guys the two various angles that we have to watch out for when we are doing comparative mythology. Just because something sounds similar, that does not mean it's the identical event. Right? So just something to keep in mind. So if we move over to, say, Norse mythology, we have Loki, Sigyn, and Angrboda. I can never pronounce that name. Angrboda? I don't know. Right? We have that situation as well. In Hindu mythology, we have a couple of these. We have Shiva, Sati, and Deksha. Right? We have those three doing their things. Right? God of love is always, of course, Venus. Why? Oh, and I guess I should have clarified this. Venus is generally always a woman in all of these mythologies. That's also a very interesting point that a lot of people just take for granted. Why is Venus a woman? Venus is a woman for one simple reason. During these stories, Venus is in her cometary form. What that means is that she is always described with long, flowing hair. That is why you will always find Venus being given a feminine name, or a feminine nomenclature, or a feminine idea. Right? Because up in the sky, when Venus is present, Venus is not just Venus as we see it today. Venus is always a cometary body. And Venus does not lose her cometary trail until she finally encounters Earth and passes by Earth and heads back towards where she is right now. Right? So she keeps her cometary form essentially this entire time. Right? It's not just round ball planets flying around up there. You have planets in a cometary form. So don't forget that. So whenever we find a female up there, there's a good chance, a really good chance, that you're talking about Venus, especially if she is a destroyer or a mother, right? And there's two reasons for that, but that's out of scope. Anyway, also in Hindu religion, we have another situation with Krishna, Rukmini, and Radha. All right, so there we have the whole situation where Krishna is married to Rukmini, but his deep love was always shown for Radha. Right? So you've got that whole love triangle going on there. In Chinese mythology, you have Chang'e, Haoyi, and Feng Mei. In Polynesian mythologies, you can generally consider Polynesian Maori or Hawaiian, or Hawaiian. That whole culture, by the way, is fascinating. I love how people try to say that they spread out using their canoes And okay, anyway, okay, I'm not going to get into that, but it's funny. They say that they sailed the Pacific Ocean using canoes, and they had no problem doing this. Well, not real. Okay, I'm not going to get into that. Okay, anyway, so Polynesian history, they basically have Pele, Hi'iaka, and Lohe. All right, same concepts once again here. In Sumerian mythology, we have Inanna, Dumuzi, and Geshtinanna. In Aztec culture, we find Quetzalcoatl, Tezcatlipoca, and Quetzalcoatl. All right, and I know I probably didn't pronounce any of those correct. I never pronounce these correctly. But do you see where I'm going with this? Like everywhere we look, we have this love triangle at a very particular point in history. And it's not always portrayed as a love triangle. Sometimes it's portrayed as like a family infighting situation. And the reason for that is because every culture is simply going to interpret the drama in the sky in its own way. It doesn't have to be a love triangle, right? So just keep an eye out for that as well. So basically, when we look at the Arthurian mythology, I mean, I was surprised as hell to see how closely it really does follow the concept of the Saturnian system breakup and the events that will take place afterwards. Now, right now, I'm just trying to analyze the earlier mythologies. It really does, in my opinion, appear that the Arthurian mythology will be built on over time and will eventually encompass other catastrophes as well. Until it gets to a point to where people have completely lost, they have no clue at what these stories were originally recording, and eventually it really will just become a mythology that people will just fictionalize at some point in history. That does happen, in my opinion, as well. So anyway, that's the Arthurian mythology, right? Like right here, we have a situation just looking at the Guinevere, Lancelot, and Arthur situation that mirrors and matches other cultures all over the planet. Now, if you are coming from a mainstream perspective, you have to, there's got to be an answer for this. Now, historians ignore this, and historians have to ignore the fact that these stories resonate all over the planet because they have no real explanation for how all these cultures have the same story. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Because if you're a mainstream historian, pretty much none of these cultures were talking to each other. Right? Certainly the Aztecs were not talking to the Norse. Right? That was not happening, apparently, according to the mainstream historians. So if communication wasn't happening, why did everybody create the exact same mythology, more or less, during this period of time? Why does everybody record the exact same kinds of catastrophic problems? Why does everybody record the same kind of supposed god drama happening in the sky during this time? A mainstream historian has no answers. It doesn't make sense, so it's ignored. But if we look at this situation from a cosmological perspective, all of a sudden the stories make more sense. Of course, it also dehumanizes the stories because we are used to looking at King Arthur as a human way, right? As a king, right? Guinevere is a hot princess. We're used to looking at these situations in a human way, but once we get rid of the human figures, we replace the human figures with planets, and we simply take what is being described as planetary motions instead of, typical human drama, suddenly the past starts to make more sense. The way civilization flows in relation to what was going on up in the sky also makes more sense. Suddenly something like, Camelot, Camelot's interesting because, and we already kind of talked about it, but everybody is looking for Camelot. Not everybody, but people, where was Camelot at? Where is this kingdom? It's never been found. The reason why it's never been found is because it's gone. It's either physically gone because it existed in antediluvian times, or it was simply a metaphor for antediluvian times, the golden age. You're never going to find it. It's not going to happen. You might find areas that maybe kind of sound like Camelot, sure, but that would be because the ancestors of the people who wrote these stories down would have reused those names. It's the same thing with King Arthur, for example. right? There's a million theories about who King Arthur was. Like, they're everywhere, right? And there's entire libraries full of this speculation. But nobody knows who the hell he was. The reason why none of these people are going to understand who King Arthur was, or who Guinevere was, or who Lancelot truly was, is because they keep looking here on Earth. Stop looking on Earth, and just look up to the sky, and then all of a sudden, all of your problems go away. Instantly. You no longer have to try to figure out where any of these things existed. The Arthurian legend, in my opinion, starts to make more sense when you attach it to Saturn theory. Alright, we'll call it here on that. There's lots more to keep going on. I'm going to keep doing this because this is fun. So in the next show, we will cover, the Lady in the Lake. And maybe we'll get to the Grail, and we have to cover the Wasteland. I think there's some other stuff we have to cover as well. Anyway, we'll keep going. Okay, I'm done. We're done talking about this.